Hey. Welcome to episode 238 of Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Freeman, and there was something on my screen, so I just did that, which probably, for you, those of you watching, probably seems strange, but that's what happened, and now we're moving on. So there's visible things that each of us struggle with. Things people in our communities probably can tell about us. We tell them, and family know them, friends know, but then like I'm thinking of my speech impediment, for example. Like the minute I open my mouth, the gig is up. People know I have a speech impediment, and they know that journey has been part of my life. But then there's invisible things that are not so easy to see, and that often we tell just a few close people about, or sometimes we tell no one. For example, I used to have tremendous anxiety day in and day out, and I'm not sure how many people were aware of that. It could have been a very small number. Why am I talking about this? Because my guest today has had very visible challenges that he's been very public about. But then another side of the same challenge has been largely invisible until recently, and we'll get more into that. But this is a fascinating conversation, I think, because we all have things we struggle with. Some of them other people know about, and some of them other people don't. So with that, I'll tell you a bit more about a guest, but first, get the right one, Jason. But first, this.
Today's guest, Nick Wendell.
Welcome back to Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. Let me tell you about Nick Wendell. I had the pleasure of seeing him deliver his TEDx talk, Notes on Survival, in Sioux Falls recently. Referencing notecards inscribed with Sharpie markers and journal entries, he recounted the challenges and opportunities that come with surviving a cancer diagnosis. In his talk, Nick spoke of the mental toll the cancer journey can take on a survivor, and how even those survivors often expect to experience profound relief and joy once they go into remission. They may also experience unanticipated guilt, fear, anxiety, pain, and other mental health challenges. At the same time, surviving cancer presents a tremendous opportunity to grow in confidence, resilience, and empathy. Nick is a first-generation college student who went on to be the director of the Center of Student Engagement at South Dakota State University, his alma mater. He's currently the executive director of the South Dakota Board of Technical Education. A fourth-term Brookings, South Dakota City Council member, and if that wasn't enough, he's the current deputy mayor of Brookings, South Dakota. Please welcome Nick to Awkwardly Awesome Podcast. Hey Nick, welcome. How are you this morning?
Hey, I'm doing well, Jason. How are you?
Great. Thanks for being here. Do you mind if we go right into it?
Yeah, let's dive right in.
So in your life, I'm assuming that before you ever had a personal experience with cancer, I'm assuming you knew people who had cancer.
Yeah, definitely.
What impression of cancer did you get from knowing these people and witnessing that cancer journeys?
I think when I was in first grade, my grandfather died of lung cancer, and the time between his initial diagnosis and his death was less than 4 months.
Holy
and so
God.
It happened really quickly, and it sort of shaped in my young life my perspective on cancer, that it was a terminal diagnosis, that it happened to older people, and that it had a devastating effect on loved ones and those folks who were left behind. As I got older, I knew more and more people who had been diagnosed with cancer and more families whose lives had been disrupted by cancer. And, the age and the characteristics of folks who had cancer broadened, right? Because I just, maybe there was a young person in my community or there was somebody's parent who was diagnosed with cancer. And over time, I sort of gained an appreciation that cancer can strike folks at any point in their life. They can have underlying conditions. It can be caused by a whole variety of factors, or we may never know what the root cause was. And I do think throughout my lifetime, my grandfather died in 1989. And so throughout my lifetime, survival rates improved, right? Mm-hmm. Treatment and diagnosis got better. And so cancer didn't have to be a terminal diagnosis. And I think as I got older, even before I was diagnosed with cancer, I did begin to gain an appreciation that lots of folks could survive, in particular, their first cancer diagnosis.
So luckily, your knowledge of what cancer was changed and expanded from that. That sounds really shocking to a first grader to see his grandfather go so fast.
Yeah, I think, when I think back on what memories I had of that period of my life or of his death, I didn't have an acute awareness, like while he was sick, that his death was imminent, but everyone around me certainly did, right? The adults in our family knew that his diagnosis and even early attempts at treatment were going to be unsuccessful. And so it happened over the holiday season. He was diagnosed just before Thanksgiving. And I do remember having a feeling of real finality during that holiday season. And what my clearest memory is of what was left in the wake of his death, right? The way it altered my family. My grandmother was then a very young widow. She was in her late 50s and my mom was in her late 20s. And so, I think probably what was starkest for me was like what remained after cancer in my family was like a pretty dramatic shift in folks' lives and in sort of the trajectory of my family. We grew up very close to my grandparents. All of my grandparents and my aunts and uncles were from my hometown. And so I was really fortunate to grow up with my extended family all around us. But that also meant that we really felt the absence of my grandfather because he would have been there, right? He would have been a part of our everyday lives in a way that he was not because it robbed him from us at a young age.
When did cancer enter your? When did the knowledge of cancer enter your? I'm not saying that well. When did you first know that you had cancer?
I mentioned in my TED Talk that my initial cancer diagnosis came on April Fool's Day, 2015. And I didn't have a lot of symptoms leading up to my diagnosis. Certainly not severe enough symptoms that I would have attributed them to something as drastic as a cancer diagnosis that was coming my way. I had a lump in my neck. My initial cancer diagnosis was thyroid cancer. And folks who have had thyroid cancer might know that one of the ways that you'll maybe detect cancer, a physical symptom, would be a cyst or a lump in your neck or swollen lymph nodes that might feel like they're associated with a cold or some type of persistent issue. That was what sort of triggered my curiosity in the winter and in the early spring of 2015. And I really just went into a regular doctor's appointment and said, I have what I think is a swollen lymph node, and it just like since Christmas time won't go down. And he detected pretty quickly that just the characteristics of that swollen lump was probably not just a swollen lymph node. And we did some initial scans at the Brookings Hospital before we decided that it might make sense to go a bit deeper. And then I was referred to Sanford Hospital in Sioux Falls. And again, did some scans, but truly did not, I was not expecting the result to be, nor did anybody say throughout the diagnostic process that like, well, we think this could be cancer. We're trying to eliminate cancer from our consideration. So it wasn't until I was like literally sitting in a doctor's office on April Fool's Day, and he said, "Nick, you have cancer." It really did not cross my mind. I did not think I was going to his office that day to hear one way or another whether I had cancer. It was not a contemplation that I'd spent much time with.
So, those words out of the doctor's mouth were very sudden to you. How did you deal initially with that shock?
It was a shock. And I will also say I was alone when I got the diagnosis because I sort of thought it was just a routine doctor's appointment. I'd had some scans. I thought we were going to kind of figure out what this lump was and if we were going to like schedule an outpatient surgery to remove it. And if I remember correctly, I think not only was it April Fool's Day, I think it was also Good Friday. It was either Good Friday or Monday, Thursday. We were leading right into the Easter weekend. And so I was already planning that we were going to head back to spend the long weekend with my family in my hometown. But at my actual diagnosis, I was alone because I wasn't anticipating a diagnosis. So I had a fair amount of time just with my thoughts. And we didn't yet know what the potential treatment protocol would be or what might happen next. I received the diagnosis and then we were going to reconvene after the holiday to sort of decide, are we going to have a surgery right away? What does treatment look like? I'd frankly never heard of thyroid cancer before. So I do think that was an interesting feeling because like I had cancer and I understood that, But then when he said it was thyroid cancer, I was like, I've never heard of that before. I don't know anybody that has I just was pretty unfamiliar.
You were like, is that even a thing?
Yeah, it just wasn't, I think we all hear a lot about lung cancer or brain cancer or breast cancer.
Mm-hmm.
Thyroid cancer had not really permeated my consciousness. So I spent a fair amount of time that weekend, I think, just trying to wrap my head around what it was and what symptoms I might have missed or what I might expect in terms of treatment or surgery that could be coming next. And I guess that the fortunate part of the timing was that I was already intending to spend the weekend with my family. And so I think that was helpful for them that we all were able to absorb that news together and then spend some days together. That probably was the fortunate thing about what happened next.
How long did the course of that treatment take?
That was an interesting process. We determined that the best course of action would be first to do a surgery to remove the lump and any cancer impacted lymph nodes in my neck. So we did what they call a full neck dissection. We took my full thyroid gland out, which is the typical protocol now. I think for those that had thyroid cancer before, maybe they left a portion of your thyroid gland and just took the part that was impacted by cancer, but they've decided now that that's just too risky and the risk of the occurrence is too high. So the typical protocol is to remove the entire thyroid gland and then to take any of the cancer impacted lymph nodes and tissue out of your neck that they can surgically. And so they removed close to 100 lymph nodes from my neck in that procedure in April. And then we prepared for a treatment protocol it's fairly unusual. And so I went through radioactive iodine treatment to kill all of the cancerous tissue that remained in my body that was hard to remove surgically. And we went through that round of treatment, and I think we did one more follow-up surgery to remove another lump that had emerged and did treatment cycles 3 different times. So from the time that I had cancer in the initial diagnosis in April of 2015 to the time that I was finally, a scan revealed that I had no new signs of cancer was over a year. Like we went deep into summer or early fall of 2016 before my scans were finally clear and my hemoglobin levels were back into a normal range.
So you it's like you had this unexpected marathon. You were in a doctor's office thinking you would just get simple news, and then the doctor's like, surprise, you're going to be running a marathon now.
Yeah, that'd be a way to compare it. Yeah.
And then you had this really intense year of winning the marathon, passing mile markers, hitting the wall, getting through the wall, then getting to the finish line. What was that? Was that the end of the story with that cancer journey? Because you had crossed the finish line. Yay!
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think it was celebratory, although I will say that because the process felt fairly monotonous, like we had a surgery, we did treatment, which the treatment protocol for thyroid cancer also includes isolation. You take a radioactive iodine pill, which makes you very radioactive, and you're so radioactive that you can have no human contact for up to 2 weeks after you take the pill. So this radioactive iodine pill is killing the cancerous tissue in your body, but it's also making you radioactive. So I would go through, after I take the pill, 10 to 14 days of total isolation. I couldn't breathe the same air as another human. I couldn't live in the same home as another human. And so I will say by the end of that process and the end of that year, I understood that the treatment was working and that we were killing the cancerous tissue. Although it recurred twice, by the end, when the scans finally revealed that, like, okay, I think we got it all, we're not expecting this to recur. It had just been such a monotonous and exhausting process. And I will also say that, like, your thyroid controls a lot of your internal functions. And I had no thyroid gland. And so when they remove your thyroid gland, after things are operating normally in your body, you begin taking a pill that, sort of replaces the thyroid activity in your body, that regulates like your metabolism, your energy level, your cognitive ability. But to prepare for treatment, you have to go off of that pill, that, like any thyroid hormones in your body during that period. So you're completely exhausted. Your diet is changed drastically. You're not intaking enough calories. Your brain is foggy. You're irritable. It's not just the isolation. It's like the physical and emotional impact of the treatment is pretty rough. One other note that I'll make, just for folks that either have experienced radioactive iodine treatment or perhaps have a recent thyroid cancer diagnosis, your thyroid tissue in your body naturally absorbs iodine. And so that's why you take the radioactive iodine pill, because that cancerous thyroid tissue naturally absorbs the radioactive iodine, and that's what kills it. But in order to make sure it works and is as effective as possible, you starve your body of iodine for 2 weeks leading up to taking the pill, so that it will naturally absorb as much of that radioactive iodine as possible. But what I didn't realize, and I think most of us don't realize, is that iodine is in almost everything. Whether it's natural iodine that's in most of our food supply, or synthetic iodine that is used in the manufacturing and production of most of our food. I mean, truly, it's in every food you can imagine. So if you were to completely go on a no iodine diet, you'd be left to have like ice water. I mean, that's genuinely what your doctor tells you. So your goal is just to reduce the iodine as much as possible. And the challenge in our food supply is that iodine is not regulated by the FDA. So it's often not on a food label, but it is in that food. And so if you're trying to prepare your body to respond to the treatment to its greatest extent, you eat almost nothing leading up to these treatment windows, because you want your body to be so starved of iodine that it absorbs as much of the radioactive iodine as possible to kill all of that tissue. So it's really challenging. If you ever look up like a thyroid cancer treatment diet, you are starving your body of any food, and you can't just walk into a store and buy food because all of it has iodine. Like my mom found a cookbook and would make like certain foods. Like there's a certain kind of bread that you can make that sort of is like a bread that doesn't have iodine in it. Interestingly, one of the food products that you can buy in a store that doesn't have iodine are Frito-Lay corn chips, because Frito-Lay doesn't use iodine in the cleaning product they use to clean their equipment. And so, but most manufacturers do. And so there is iodine in most food because they use it in the cleaning product that they use on their equipment. So you really become kind of an expert in what has iodine and what doesn't, but you're just exhausted throughout the treatment process. And so by the time I got to the end of it and I finally had sort of no new signs of cancer in my body, there was such relief, but I also was just so exhausted. It was hard to be celebratory. It took a while to get kind of back to my fighting strength and mindset.
So I mean, that whole iodine and then the isolation, that sounds really, really grueling. Oh my gosh.
It's not great. And I did it 3 times that year. So it gets less great the deeper you get into it, to be honest.
Oh, you did that 3 times.
Yeah.
So you're going through this and get to the end, and you get to the all clear diagnosis, and you're just so exhausted and just know you need to recover from this horribly grueling marathon. But someone from the outside, someone who maybe didn't know you that well, knew you casually, might hear that, well, Nick is cancer free now, and they might think you were jubilant and jumping up and down. And how can someone on the outside support someone who has just survived cancer?
I think one of the ways, if you've not been on a super personal cancer journey, whether you are the individual that had cancer or a close loved one had cancer, because I also think cancer impacts loved ones in really deep and dramatic ways. I think if you haven't been there, but you want to be supportive and you want to be empathetic, I think it is about providing room and space for folks to sort of acknowledge their experience. And, it's sort of like the old adage, like if you know one person that's had cancer, you know one person that's had cancer, right? Like the experience is different for everyone, and the experience of survival is different for everyone.
The experience of cancer is different for everyone, and the experience of survival is different for everyone. Wow.
It is. And I think, if folks around us want to be supportive and help folks sort of help survivors sort of navigate what survival looks like and how to kind of return to some sense of normalcy, part of that is just about like being really open and giving space for people to say, hey, my cancer journey looked like this, and the months and years after I went into remission looked like this for me. And that might not be the same as what you expected it to look like or what you have heard it looked like for other people. And I might not even be feeling super celebratory right now. I recognize how fortunate I am that I survived cancer, but I'm also left with like how cancer changed my body, how it changed my mind, the medical debt that I have, how it changed my relationship with my family, how I feel like I've been a burden to the people around me for months and years now who have had to transport me to and from doctor's appointments and stay with me when I was recovering, have been worried about me, and I can tell, but I can't do anything to erase that. I mean, it just changes the dynamic of how you operate with folks for a while. And I would say for me also, this is a bit of a spoiler alert, but I got cancer again, right? And so I think after I went into remission in 2016, there was always this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that cancer could come back. But I really hushed that voice, right? I sort of forced myself not to worry a lot about that and not to invest a lot of time and energy worrying about cancer coming back or it metastasizing, or, I leaned into the statistics, which for thyroid cancer survivors now are that lots of folks who get diagnosed with thyroid cancer will survive it. And in many cases, it won't metastasize to another part of the body if you catch it early enough and you treat it thoroughly enough. So I really forced myself to lean into that and just resume normalcy, which I think was good and healthy. But post 2016, I didn't allow myself a lot of room to think about cancer or worry about cancer. I really tried to just go back to, my life before cancer to the best of my ability. And I think maybe that's why when the cancer came back in 2019, it was so hard to accept because I just forced myself to sort of lean forward into normalcy. And it felt like, gosh, you were naive enough to think you were going to be well for the rest of your life, and now cancer's here again.
So someone on the outside, what's the balance between being supportive and asking you how recovery, how the post-cancer treatment is going, and then but then also you didn't want to talk about cancer.
I was, again, only speaking for myself. I was okay talking about cancer. Like, it wasn't a downer for me. It wasn't hard for me to talk about. I made a decision early on after my initial diagnosis that perhaps it would be healthiest, like, for my family and for my community and the people around me, if I just shared the news of my cancer and gave folks some periodic updates on social media. That felt vulnerable, and I wasn't super comfortable with that initially. I try to be sensitive to not be an oversharer in a social media environment or update folks on my everyday life. I'm not somebody who uses social media in that way. But I did recognize that if I just declared clearly that I had cancer, this is the type of cancer I have, this is the plan, and then occasionally check in if I had an update, that sort of lifted the burden off of my family and my loved ones to have to update folks or tell that story. I grew up in a little town, and most people are interested because they care and they want to know what's going on with folks. Even though I hadn't lived there for a lot of years at that time, they still cared, and there were still lots of people in my community and in my hometown that cared, and people in Brookings and in my neighborhood and in my church family that cared. And so I just felt like that was a good way to update people. But it also meant that that meant a lot of people sort of knew what was going on with me, and because they cared, wanted to ask questions and wanted to get updates when they saw me. And I just always tried to maintain that framework that folks are asking because they care, not because they're nosy, not because this is salacious. They just genuinely care, and they want to show that care. And I tried to have that framework, and I found that I responded best and it felt best if people truly were commenting in a way that conveyed care and not making assumptions to say, oh, you must be so happy or so relieved, or you must feel a certain way. And I think that's true in any situation, right? Don't assume how someone else is feeling or how they're going to respond to a certain event in their life. Maybe just acknowledge it and prepare room for them to tell you how it felt. I think that's kind of a good rule of thumb, whether you're talking about cancer or sort of any other event that might impact someone's life.
It's so tempting to come in with those assumptions and say, well, this is how I think you might feel, but that is an assumption that's not you or your experience. So that's really good to watch out for that.
Mm-hmm. I think in particular, if you're sort of struggling with expectation or the way you think you should be feeling, whether that's the way you should be physically feeling, like your recovery should be moving at a certain pace, or your mental or emotional state, you're telling yourself the treatment worked, I'm in survival, my body is healing, the sun is shining, I'm still here. Logically, all of that is true, and all of that should contribute to the way you're feeling. But if there's a disconnect between that list of things you know to be true and how you're feeling internally, someone else saying you should be feeling this way sort of just piles on, right? It just gives you a deeper sense that what is wrong with me? Why am I not celebratory today in the way that I should be? What am I taking for granted?
And then cancer, you received a second cancer diagnosis. What type of cancer was that?
Well, my cancer journey has been abnormal for a variety of reasons. And part of that is because the second kind of cancer I got is also not one that lots of folks know about. Like, I don't have a ribbon color or a 5K dedicated to the kinds of cancers I've had. But the second cancer I got was a deep nerve tissue sarcoma, and it grew right in the center of my body. I think folks that maybe have heard of sarcoma or are familiar with sarcoma often think of it as a lump that grows in one of your arms or one of your legs. A lot of folks that get a sarcoma, that's where it originates, but they can also grow in sort of the trunk of your body, and that's where mine originated. I had a lump between my shoulder blades. There was just a little bump that kind of had popped to the surface. And because of my cancer history, I decided to get it looked at as soon as I detected it. And my doctor initially thought it was just a cyst, and there were not really irregularities associated with it, and I didn't have any other symptoms. But because of my cancer history, we did a biopsy before we removed that lump. And the night before I was supposed to have an outpatient procedure to remove what we thought was just a lump, my doctor called with the biopsy results, which confirmed that it wasn't just a benign lump, but that it was a malignant tumor. And he believed then that it was this deep nerve tissue sarcoma. And that happened to be a rare enough form of sarcoma that they didn't treat it anywhere in South Dakota. So that was the spring of 2019. I got that phone call, I think, on a Thursday evening. And within a couple of days, like by the next Monday, I was at Mayo Clinic in Rochester, sort of preparing for another round of treatment for another rare form of cancer, and making some pretty tough decisions with my family on sort of what would we do next, back in the throes of a different form of cancer.
But part of that cancer journey which you talk about in your TEDx talk is at one point when you were really sick, you kept telling yourself, I will walk 3 miles, I will walk 3 miles, I will walk 3 miles.
Yeah.
Could you tell a little bit of that story?
Throughout my adult life, I have run 3 miles pretty much every day. It's just a part of my habit. Obviously, it's good for my physical health, but it puts me in a really good mental frame for most days. So in particular, if my life is chaotic or I'm feeling a little down, I know if I can just go run 3 miles, I'll feel better. And
so running the 3 miles is kind of medicine to you.
It is. And if I ever skip it or I ever convince myself that I don't have time or I don't feel well, I always regret it. And so pretty much every day, I just try to put some miles on. And in the fall of 2019, after I'd gone through a long treatment protocol and had a massive surgery to remove this tumor from the center of my body, I couldn't walk around the block, let alone run 3 miles. And so I would just write, I will run 3 miles again. I will run 3 miles again. I will run 3 miles again. Sort of as a manifesting exercise, I guess. I needed to see it in black and white to convince myself, like, I will get there again. And I can't use that as, in your words, medicine today, but I'm going to get myself to a place where I am well enough to do that again. I'm going to resume normalcy in my life, and that's going to be one of the measures I use to indicate that I'm sort of back to some normalcy. And so it was good to have that kind of milestone on the horizon, but it was also devastating at the time to know how far away it felt.
How long do you have to wait to run those 3 miles?
Sure. It was months. I had the surgery to remove. So So after my diagnosis in the spring of 2019, I had to move to Rochester and spent most of the first 3/4 of the summer of 2019 receiving daily proton beam radiation treatments. And so it's a phenomenal technology. It's a very targeted and isolated form of radiation. Because my tumor was in the center of my body, obviously we were really worried about other organs and my ribs, the bones that were surrounding this tumor. So the proton beam radiation that I had to access at Mayo was essential. And that was all leading up to a really massive surgery in the late summer of 2019 to remove the tumor. And so I was in the midst of recovery throughout the rest of the summer and fall of 2019. And because that surgery was so large, it also required like plastic surgery to, it was a very intensive, invasive surgery. And it had my recovery had some stops and starts, right? I was rushed back to Mayo to have fluid removed from my chest. I developed a staph infection. Like my recovery was not linear and did not go as well as I would have hoped it would. And so just to get to a place where I could like have sort of a normal daily routine was really elongated. And then to get to a place where I could like go for a walk by myself and get some fresh air before I ever thought about like pounding pavement and running again was into, we were into late 2019, early 2020 before I could sort of do that again. So I definitely had to like get comfortable with this idea that you're going to have to manifest it into being before you can ever get to a place where you could physically do that again. And for me, that was really disruptive.
So like it would take so much for us patients.
Oh gosh, yes. Which I am not. Like anyone who knows me well knows that like that is not a signature of mine. I'm not an overly patient guy.
Wow. So at that point, whenever you ran your first 3 miles again, it would be easy to say, "Oh wow, Nick, you went through all this. You were victorious. You're literally winning. Your manifestation has turned into reality. You are absolutely good now. Congratulations." But what was that time really like when you were able to run the 3 miles again?
When I have an opportunity to speak to groups now, I try to be as real as possible because I think that's helpful so that folks can anticipate what hardship might look like if they are on the front end of a cancer diagnosis. And folks who are loved ones of cancer patients or trying to build community around cancer patients and survivors have a realistic view of what that might look like. For me, it was really challenging, and it was perhaps most challenging because it was unexpected. I had survived cancer once, and it was hard, but I sort of felt like, okay, you will get to a place where your body will show no new signs of cancer. And then incrementally, you'll sort of get back to normalcy and you'll feel good again, and you won't worry about cancer every day, and it'll be fine. That's sort of a blip on your radar. My second cancer diagnosis and what happened in the months after was much more devastating and much harder to manage. And the reason I think this is important to talk about is because there are so many more cancer survivors in America today than there were 30 and 40 years ago. Like the year I was born, there were like 3 million cancer survivors in America. In many cases, because cancer had a much higher mortality rate at the time, right? The treatments weren't as good. Diagnosis came much later. Not as many folks could survive cancer 40 years
How
ago.
many survivors of cancer are there in America today?
Just over 18 million. And it's
So
projected,
from 3 million to 18 million.
and by the end of the decade, it's projected there'll be close to 23 million cancer survivors in our country. I think the good news is, in many cases, that's because our treatment has improved and that folks are getting diagnosed earlier and have better access to care. The downside of that is more folks among us have experienced cancer and are trying to navigate survivorship. And if you're a relatively young cancer patient, as I was in 2015, the likelihood that cancer will reoccur in your life eventually and that you'll get a second cancer diagnosis is fairly high. And so not only are you navigating survivorship, but there is some likelihood that you will encounter cancer again, and sort of your worst fear that is always sort of in the recesses of your mind that the cancer is going to come back. When that comes true, it has a pretty devastating consequence on your psyche. And you have to really frame fear and anxiety in a realistic way, right? I suppose it's like if you're a little kid and you're really afraid of the monsters under the bed and everybody convinces you that they're not actually there, but then you take a look and there's one there. The cancer does actually come back. You got to figure out how to navigate the rest of your life without fear and anxiety that can be sort of crippling. And that was hard. And I think what was most surprising to me as a 2-time cancer survivor was the mental health impact that cancer had on me as I moved into survivorship in late 2019 and early 2020. I had not adequately prepared for that I was really sad. I was angry. I had a lot of anxiety. And at the same time, everyone around me was saying, you survived cancer twice. You must be walking on air, right? Like you must just step onto your doorstep every morning and take a breath of fresh air and thank God that you're here. In the logical part of my brain, that was true. And there were some days where I had the clarity to feel that way. But at least initially, there were a lot more days where like I could not tap into that kind of feeling. There was too much other stuff in the way.
So how did you move from the place of largely invisible pain, invisible, very intense emotions to where you are now, giving TEDx talks, and doing all you're doing professionally, huh?
I think for me, part of the process was recognition, and I'm very fortunate. I actually I have a master's degree in counseling. Right, my focus is on higher education administration, but the preparatory work you do to go into the field of higher education often comes through counseling and counseling college-age students. And so I had sort of a framework in my mind, and I could recognize some of the signs, and I could articulate what I was experiencing. It didn't mean that I had a solution, but I wasn't in denial about what I was feeling. It clicked for me pretty early on that like you're sort of in a period that may even be a temporary period of depression. And you're feeling a level of depression and anxiety that I had not previously encountered. And I think one thing that benefited me was being open and aware that was happening. And then it was about acknowledging it, which I do think for cancer survivors can be really challenging. And again, I'll just speak to my experience, but when it was occurring to me, and when I was in the midst of recovery, that I was struggling with my mental health, it was hard for me to get the courage to acknowledge that because my family had been such a support system to me throughout 2 cancer diagnoses, right? Throughout surgeries and treatments and time spent at Mayo and traveling back and forth. And like the recovery was brutal, in particular the second time. but I was starting to heal, and it felt like we were all just waiting for sort of like the light at the end of the tunnel. And so it was very hard for me to think like, well, I'm acknowledging that like my body is healing as we hoped it would, but now it feels like my brain is breaking a little bit. And how do I say that after everything we've all been through together? Because it wasn't lost on me that I wasn't going through cancer alone. Being the parents of an adult with cancer is really challenging as well, right? Being loved ones and the child of someone with cancer and being a community of support is really hard. And so now I'm also going to say like, wow, I'm getting better and the treatment seemed to have worked, but now I'm struggling mentally and I need your support in a different way. I need you to be open to that conversation.
How do I say that? Yes, there's good news, but then there's also bad news.
Yeah.
How do I say that?
Yeah, that was challenging.
And how do you say that?
I just was honest, right? I just sort of started to tell the story and say like, I don't feel well. Like I need to probably see somebody and talk to somebody about the way that I'm feeling and develop some skills to get through this, right? And like, I need to maintain this. I can't ignore it. It's not going away. I do think there is some real trauma in experiencing cancer. And I sort of packed that trauma away the first time because I wanted to return to normalcy as quickly as possible. So then when it came back, a lot of that trauma reemerged. And then the new trauma got dumped on top. And I think the other thing that's hard in acknowledging how that feels is you feel some guilt because we all know too many people who didn't get a chance to survive cancer, right? It goes all the way back to losing my grandfather to cancer in the late 80s and seeing how devastating that was to so many people around me. And now I had a chance to survive cancer twice, but I'm still like complaining about the anxiety and the fear and the sadness that comes from that. I think I first had to like frame that correctly and acknowledge like this is still legitimate, even though I'm lucky to have survived. Both things can be true. And I have to remind myself that both things are true. It does not diminish the fortune that I have to have survived cancer and to have had access to high quality care and to have loved ones around me. But mental health is not that logical. Right? It doesn't.
Mental health is not that logical.
You can't just make a list of the things that are true and erase the stuff that you're feeling and experiencing in your mental health.
What you're describing also reminds me, and this is maybe talked about more, like a soldier coming back from war, and it's like, oh my gosh, you survived, you're so lucky. And at the same time, that person might be experiencing all kinds of mental trauma and PTSD.
I think whatever the trauma is in your life that has been introduced into your life, whether that was a sudden trauma or an event that unfolded over time, some of the tactics that you might use to address it and power through it are similar. Like for me, when we talk about like getting back into a routine where I was taking care of my physical well-being and I was running every day and I had a habit that felt worthwhile, it made me feel like my body was healing and I could do something every day to start to get better. As I started to manifest that I knew I had to get to that place. And then as I started to get to that place, it did have a positive impact. And to have that milestone on the horizon that I was working toward did have a positive impact on my mental well-being. Writing had a positive impact on my mental well-being. Like, I joke in the talk that I don't keep a diary, but I keep a journal and a stack of note cards on my nightstand and at my desk and with me, because I kind of am always jotting down ideas or things in my notes app on my phone, things I want to remember, things that I'm either inspired by, or an idea that I think is pretty cool, or something I want to go back to and dig into deeper. And that was really helpful for me. Like writing down my thoughts made them feel more real and helped me to process them. And lots of folks talk about that, like the value of journaling when you're going through something. And for me, that was really helpful. And then, part of why we're talking today, part of why I felt kind of tugged to do a TED Talk, why I have shared this story more widely, is it gave some purpose and meaning to the experience, and speaking it out loud and having other folks sort of receive that or be able to relate to it, or say, I also am a cancer survivor, or my mom is a cancer survivor, and this is something we have whispered about in our family, or this is something that I knew to be true, but I've been too afraid to acknowledge, was pretty empowering. And I think this, again, is unique to me, but I do think other folks could relate to it. Something that is helpful and restorative to me is having an impact, right? Having some purpose or meaning behind my experiences and what I do helps me. I know that about myself. That is a motivator for me. And so I do think that clicked over for me fairly early on. Like, I need to tell this story, right? Like if there's any meaning behind surviving cancer twice before you're 40, it's that you have a pretty good story to tell, and maybe it'll be helpful to other people. So tell every part of that story.
So you did the things writing a physical wellness routine, being of service, and did you also get professional
I did.
help in addition?
Yeah, I did. It was pretty clear to me that I did need to, seek some professional help as I was trying to process the experience of having cancer recur, the experience of survivorship, the very real trauma of like how cancer changed my body, and changed a lot of my relationships. Like I knew I'm not going to be able to navigate this by writing in a journal every night before I go to bed. I need to probably go to therapy and talk to somebody to develop some stronger tools, but also just to process what this means and why it feels this way. I sort of am a believer that if we all had access to therapy and some mental health support from professionals, we could all function at a higher level. I think it's just a positive process for anyone to go through. And so I'm fortunate enough to have been able to access care and took advantage of that. And I wish everybody could have that kind of access.
Maybe that's a brilliant vision for the world, that one day everyone will have access to therapy. Wow.
Yeah.
That's a big vision. So just a few more quick things.
Yeah.
One thing that occurs to me is that when cancer comes, it kind of can overshadow parts of your life. I mean, in your accomplishments, I wanted to have time, and we don't have time. You're first generation college student who went on to work at his college, and then you got a master's, and now you have this amazing job leading the technical colleges.
Mm-hmm.
And plus you're on the city council and you're a deputy mayor, and all that will be worth like 5 podcast episodes. Those are all huge, amazing stories, and we don't. And they end up being the subject of this podcast, but I just want to emphasize that just because someone goes through a major thing like cancer, it doesn't take away from all the other parts of their lives at all.
And to add to that, everything you just named, I feel like I am a better version of those things now after cancer than I was before. I am not probably enough of an optimist to say I'm glad I got cancer, but if I was going to get cancer, and I was going to get cancer twice, one thing I will say is that it has made me a better person by almost every measure. I am a more empathetic professional now. I think more deeply about the meaning behind the work that I do and the work that we all do in terms of educating young people, providing opportunity for folks to get trained in a skill, to go into a profession that they love, that life has meaning. All of that to me is connected in a way now that I'm not sure I had a big enough perspective before cancer. As somebody who serves in an elected role in my community, it is a reminder that everybody just kind of like living in your city, going through their daily lives, is going through something that you can't see, that you don't know about, that you can't relate to. And so even in policy making, in decisions that we make that impact neighborhoods and the way folks do business and the way folks use transportation in your community and how they all live together, all of that has an impact on people's lives. And our government, in particular, our municipal governments, should be doing all we can do to make people's lives easier, because everybody has something that is already weighing them down. The neighborhood they live in, the streets they drive on, the stores they have to go to shouldn't add to the burden. They should remove barriers. And I kind of think that's a cool thing that municipal, local governments have an opportunity to do. And that's a perspective I have that is heightened after going through cancer and experiencing survivorship, that I don't know that it was there before.
That all gives me goosebumps. Good goosebumps. I ask everyone on the show this question. Nick, what does doing your imperfect best mean to you? I'll tell you really quickly what it means to me. Doing my imperfect best means I envision the best I want for myself in my life. I go towards it when mistakes, obstacles, what have you come up. I try to learn from all that and refocus on my best instead of giving up. What does doing your imperfect best mean to you, Nick?
You know, when I think about that phrase and that framing, for me, doing my imperfect best means being radically honest with myself about whether or not I showed up in the ways that I could and that I set myself up to be as successful and useful as possible, but also being really graceful with myself and the people around me to say, it is okay if today did not turn out exactly how you had envisioned it, or if this other person in your orbit didn't contribute the way you thought they would. We've got to have some grace and some empathy for each other. And so for me, my imperfect best is when I am honest with myself about how I showed up, but also leave room for some grace for my shortcomings.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And then, do you know when your TEDx talk will be live?
I don't. I do know that the local organizers have sort of finished the editing process and it gets sent off to the national organization. And to my knowledge, we don't really get notice about when they're going to drop it on the TED YouTube page, but it's supposed to be coming over the next couple of weeks. So I'll be excited to see it drop with everybody else.
So to all of you watching, look for Nick's TED Talk here sometime in the next month or two, and thank you all for tuning in, and thank you especially Nick for for coming on and talking to us about kindness towards ourselves, authenticity, kindness towards others in the many facets of the cancer journey. Thank you for giving voice to so much that is so often not talked about.
Yeah, thanks for creating a platform to have this conversation, Jason. I appreciate it.
And Nick, please, I'm going to end this now, but please stay on for a few minutes. Things have to upload, okay?
Sounds good.
And thanks to all of you for tuning in, whether you're watching this live or 25 years from now. And please keep tuning in, and please keep commenting, and most of all, remember you are the best and only you in the world. Thank you for being here.